get going.
Yeah, beautiful.
So we might make a start. Thanks everyone for coming along to this second industry talk within the B.Comm media program. This is the second. We've got a few more lined up before the end of semester. And I'd like to introduce Mike Jones, who's here. He's joining us live from Sydney. And Mike works for a company called EveryCloud Productions. EveryCloud is the company behind some amazing Australian content, including the Miss Fisher franchise and Newton's Law. It was begun by Deb Cox and Fiona Eagger, who between them have produced or created stuff like SeaChange, The Gods of Wheat Street, Crash and Burn, East of Everything, and After the Deluge. And EveryCloud has a long history with RMIT, and managing director Fiona Eagger is an adjunct professor at RMIT. But our guest today is Mike Jones. Mike and I have been talking and collaborating for a little while, and we're going to tease something at the end of the talk that I'm certainly very excited about. And Mike is the head of content and development at EveryCloud Productions. He is also a writer and a story editor with experience and accolades across a range of genres. So first of all, Mike, thank you so much for talking to us today.
Beautiful. Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
I guess my first question is, looking at your title and talking to you for a little while, what does a head of content and development do? What is the role?
There are so many roles in screen production where people go, what does that really mean? I mean, writer and director seems obvious, but everything else is a bit of a haze. Look, to understand what my job is really to understand how the Australian TV industry works, in the sense that it is content is driven by production companies. So in the past, it would tend to be driven by studios and networks, but it's now driven by production companies who are essentially the in-between between the creative and the network. So where the production company will find the IP, find the script, find the talent, put it together, then they sell it to the network and develop the show and then make it. And so head of development, every production company in Australia, from the really big ones down to the really small ones, and EveryCloud is sort of a medium-sized company, has a head of development. And I guess it boils down to three things that I'm responsible for. The first is strategy. So that's really working out what shows do we want to make and who do we want to make it for. And that involves knowing what's the flavor, what's the taste, what kind of genres are hot, or what kinds of shows might the audiences worldwide be looking for, and what are networks after. So you've got to be a bit savvy. That's just the strategic end. The bulk of the job is the development part, and that's the creative development part. So in really simple terms, I'm the girl who's got to find the talent and the IP. So find the scripts I want to make, or find the books I want to option, or find the particular writing talent I want to work with, and put together those creative teams, develop scripts, so oversee the writers' rooms, run the creative development process and steer it creatively. And then the third part is the networks. I've got to sell it to the network. I've got to walk in and pitch it and say, hey, I've got this great show, I've got this great team, you know us as a company, let's make this show together. So between those three things, you're wearing quite a few hats that's really using different parts of your brain, a real strategic part, and a kind of real business part, and then this obviously enormous creative hat of keeping wheels on a creative show as it goes along. So
never a dull moment, you might say.
Or budgets. I have to deal with budgets. They can be a little bit dull, but apart from that, it's certainly an exciting. And having been a writer and script producer for a good number of years, the writer's room and in those processes, work with writers is where I'm sort of most happy. That's my happy place, and that's where I spend a good chunk of my job.
So on that note, maybe just tell us a little bit about your background and experience before you came to EveryCloud.
Yeah, and I'm pretty new in the job at EveryCloud. I only started there in January, but I have had a long association with them. But look, my own journey was, I always wanted to write, and for a very short while, I thought I wanted to be an actor, but I grew out of that pretty quick. So I always wanted to write, and I began in theatre. Like I think certainly a lot of people in my generation, that was where you could get your start. These days, I think those entry points are a lot different. But I started in theatre, had a couple of plays produced early. By the time I'd finished university, I moved to the US, and I worked as a very low level staff writer and script editor on terribly D-grade sitcom pilots and the sort of shit. I think my first screen credit was I co-wrote an exercise video script. So just never be afraid to start at the bottom. And and I worked in the US I worked in the US for a couple of years. When I came back to Australia, it was a mix of theatre and screen stuff. And then because there just wasn't that much writing work around, and I was still pretty young and didn't have a lot of experience, because this was right at the period where the collapse of the old, sort of the Grundys and the Crawfords and the old big Australian TV studios that would make 10 shows a year of 44 episodes each, these kind of ridiculous numbers, that would fade it. So the world had changed a lot for TV writing and hadn't really found its new path out. So I worked as a camera operator and editor, and I worked in post-production. I did some motion graphics. I did all sorts of, odd things. I worked as a journalist even for a while. These were all, in hindsight, very valuable skills. But then, so the last decade, 12 years or so, it's been mostly story editing and script producing. So overseeing running writers' rooms as a story consultant, developing stories. Worked a lot with the ABC and other production companies in Australia like Princess Pictures and Jungle, and I worked overseas for a while with WarnerBros as well, and all in various development roles, big sphere of script development. And then most recently, to bring up to where we're at the moment, the most recent stuff I did was working with SweetPotatoFilms at a series called Kettering Incident. Was story editor on the Gloaming, which was on Stan, which came out at the start of this year, and then moved from there into the job I'm currently in at EveryCloud, which was kind of like felt a little bit like getting a real job after 15 odd years of being a freelancer and sort of going gig to gig, as most people in this industry do. I finally got a real job, in-house a real job.
I wonder, just to sort of jump back a little bit, just perhaps for the students' benefit, who might be they might understand the role of a screenwriter, they might have a rough idea of sort of a writer's room and how that might work. How does that differ from a story editor? What is that role, and how does it differ perhaps from a more traditional screenwriter, scriptwriter role?
Look, it can be a slippery. All these terms can be slippery, and there's a whole bunch of them. You go from storyliner, staff writer. Though that's more US term, but storyliner, script editors, story editors, script producers, up to showrunners. And they're all roles that sit within a writer's room, depending on the show and depending on the makeup of the writer's room. So it's not like every show has all these roles. In the US, those writer's room processes are absolutely regimented and very much driven by sort of union guidelines. So they're very fixed. In Australia, they're much more fluid. So we develop writers' rooms depending on the show, and they tend to be smaller rooms. So a script editor's role can range. A script editor will go from, on one hand, being like an assistant to the showrunner and revising scripts, compiling notes and feedback, doing revisions, that sort of thing. Sometimes what we call a script editor is also more like a story consultant. So they're more like an expert you hire in to help you with your project. And particularly if you're fairly new in early phase of your career, say you had an idea, you made a web series or something and Screen Australia want to invest in it, or Film Victoria or something, then they may insist you get a story consultant or a script editor on to help you, which is someone a bit more experienced to shape it. So that role can be a little bit more slippery. And then a story editor is kind of more like a right-hand man to a story producer. Right-hand woman, I should say, to a story producer. So they're responsible for plotting shows with the showrunner or the story producer, overseeing usually the long story arcs. They'll leave the individual episodes to the writer and script editors, and then we're dealing with the story arcs across the series. But that varies a lot depending on the nature of the show, because obviously a 4-part self-contained mini SBS is a different show to, say, The Heights on ABC, where it's got 20 odd episodes a year. So, and everything in between.
Yeah, right. Amazing. So
just one thing I'd add to that. Oh, sorry, mate. What I would add, the Australian Writers Guild, if you're a member or you're an associate member or student member of the Australian Writers Guild, they've got definitions of all those jobs, which are quite handy. They've got a document on their website which just specifies what those roles are. I think they probably need a little bit of updating, but that's not a bad resource.
Yeah, cool. So I guess, let's move to the present, to EveryCloud. What drew you to the role? Was there anything about the company itself that appealed to you? And in terms of, again, as you say, sort of taking this next step out of the freelance world, perhaps into, a more quote unquote regular working arrangement. Was there anything that appealed to you from?
Well, they pay me every week and I get superannuation, which is two things I haven't had in a very long time. No, look, the truth is, for a number of years, I've been wanting to move into overseeing a head of development kind of role. And there's a couple of reasons. You're a freelancer like I do. And I think it's important. I'll just do a sidebar to say it's really important to think about if you want to be a writer and you think of yourself being a writer, it's really important to think about the sphere of script development, because very often you may or may not be doing the actual writing, but you may be in all those other roles. So if you're looking for a career in writing, better to think about it as being a role in script development, which might mean sometimes writing, sometimes you're a story producer, sometimes you're a script editor, and so on. So in that field that I've been working in, one of the problems you have is often a very short tenure. So you helicoptered in to fix problems and you fly back out again, or you're there at the beginning but not there at the end. And one of the frustrations for me after a good number of years in the industry was really looking for the ability to be able to see things through and have a sort of higher level creative throughput, to be able to see things right through to the end. As a step up for me. So I've been looking for those roles, but the truth is they come up very rarely. There's only so many production companies in Australia. Those roles there's only a few of them around at any given time. You kind of have to wait for someone to die to vacate a seat. But EveryCloud was a company I'd worked with on a number of occasions before and got to know quite well. Most significantly, a few years back, I was a story producer on a telemovie short form series we did called Deadlock. For the ABC, which was a really complex show, little show, but a really narratively complex show with multiple points of view and a tough shoot, a really complex, tough shoot, but a lot of fun. And it was just during that process, I realized that thing that I think we all look for in our careers, particularly creative careers, is who's the people you really want to work with. I tend to find this industry, I tend to be an optimist, and I tend to find this industry mostly populated with pretty good people. It's good creative people and good collaborators. Sometimes it gets a bad rap, like you work with us. I just don't think that's true. But with EveryCloud, I found a company that were very dynamic, very focused on IP, so they really own the intellectual property they make and they exploit it and they mine it and they really make the most of it. Some companies work a little more fee for service, but EveryCloud's really about building real story worlds that have life. And the two creators who founded the company, Fiona, Eagger, and Deb Cox, are enormously experienced. And I think one of the most important things you can do in your career is seek out the people you can learn from, really, and be very hard-edged about that. I think too often we surround ourselves with people who think the same, and too often we will seek out people who know the same things because we feel we can talk to them. But I think it's really important, and this goes for all stages of your career, whether you're at a senior level or just starting out, is find the people to put around you who know things you don't know. And I certainly get it with EveryCloud. Where here's a company that in many cases make kind of TV that I'm not used to making. They think differently. They have a way of approaching business and IP that I didn't know anything about. And I went, that's the kind of company I want to work for.
You mentioned before we started that you might have some bandwidth issues. You're sort of dropping in and out with the video.
Did I?
But that's all good. That's all good.
If it gets really bad, do you want to kill the video and we just go audio?
Yeah, maybe if you just want to do that, at least for the next little bit, we can drop back in maybe a little bit later and see how it's going.
Is that it? Have I gone sound only now?
We're now a podcast.
All right. Look, and I apologize for that. It's COVID-19 with my wife in her office downstairs and my daughter doing a Zoom class with her fellow students. We're sucking some bandwidth today.
That's completely fine. So I guess the next question would be around sort of recent changes in the industry, around how perhaps, screenwriting, story development, content development has changed in the digital era. So particularly with, recent technological change, shifts to digital workflows, and even, in our current situation, with how digitized and mediatized we all are currently. What are some of the things about the process, about that kind of role, that kind of work that you've seen change?
Look, it's a great question, but it's a really big one. We got 4 hours. Really unpack this. The thing I probably left out when I was sort of talking about my very quick backstory is coming back from the US into Australia, and then that middle period before I then became more established in script development. There just wasn't a lot of film and TV work around, so I went and worked in other spaces, and a good chunk of that was interactive and cross-platform, and that followed me. I've written a couple of VR projects, and I've worked in a little bit in video gaming, and sort of multi-transmedia projects. And what I had to do very quickly in that process was changed the way I thought about where the emphasis sat. And it was very easy to jump to what's different. And I quickly found out that the most useful way to work in those spaces, wherever a new technology reveals a new space, is to ask yourself what's consistent, what's the same first, before you leap to the new, because you've got you're much better equipped to understand how to do if you understand what's remained. And that applies across everything, whether it's dealing with a new platform, whether it's video gaming or VR or interactive, whether it's dealing with shifts in what would otherwise be traditional media, so the move from broadcast TV to SVOD TV and on demand and binge viewing and so on. I think it's really important to look at what has remained. And so there were key things for me that stood out. One was that the creative process doesn't change near so much as the audience consumption patterns do. And when you understand how people are consuming something, then you can understand how the story might change. And that happens. It's easy to look at a project or an interactive project and understand that really obviously, but it's no less profound when we look at things like the big shift in Australian TV and worldwide TV was the shift from television shows being 20 to 44 episodes a year and very, very long running, a self-contained story of the week kind of stuff, to the heavily serialized short run TV. So now it's almost rare to see a series that's more than 12 episodes. In Australia, it tends to be more like 6 to 8, and 8 tends to be your max for a drama. And that's, the quality's gone up, the cost per hour, the budgets have gone up. But the most important part of that is the consumption pattern. And when the consumption pattern changes, when we'll watch 3 or 4 episodes in a row or binge a whole series over a weekend, and when we can watch demand, just that big umbrella term of on demand, then it actually changes the nature of the kinds of stories you tell in that medium. It's no accident that we tell a lot more serialized drama, long running complex storylines than we ever used to, because you try watching a really complex story drama 1 episode a week, it's like your brain can't hold it. You kind of need to binge. So there's the way we've shifted in watching starts to affect the kind of stories you can tell. And then once you've shifted the kind of stories you're telling and want to tell and which audiences want, the writer's room start to change. The way you're plotting shows, the way you're mapping the wall, the way you're interacting with other writers, the way you deploy your creative team around that. And it's one of those areas where it seems to be not a particularly exciting or advanced technology, just that simple space of streaming or bingeable television or catch-up TV. But its impact on the way we think about what kinds of genres, what kind of shows, and how we'll write them is quite profound. And that's before you even get into whether you can do this remotely, run a writer's room virtually. The writer's room for a show I worked on last year, the Gloaming, we did all remotely. My boss, showrunner of the show, was in Tasmania. We did that all remotely with sort of a cycle of Skype meetings followed by online notes, which were in shared documents and so on and so on. So I think there's a consistency there you can look at how things were done and then look at how audiences are consuming it. And between those two, you'll start to find handholds for development and thinking about how do you want to work. And what I would say is that that has become the most important creative question I think we can ask on any creative process, whether it's dealing with old or new technology, is to work out how to work. It is to not assume there's one way of doing things. And I'll give you a really concrete example. I wrote a virtual reality project a couple of years back and set about writing it much like a screenplay, in that it had a story and a cause and effect, and it had dialogue and scenes. Then it had this layer of interactivity over the top of it. But what I realized really quickly, especially when I was on set, sort of watching it all sort of fumble a little bit, was that I needed to draw it, that this script didn't require more words. What it required was a mud map. I needed to draw the spaces to understand where people were going to be, because the number one driving mechanic of that show was spatial location, where you were at time and where you were to trigger a certain story event. And then from that, the proximity by the way people interact. Now that was pretty unique to VR. And I went into the next project, essentially starting with a visual mud map, top-down map before I got to dialogue and mapping out where I wanted people to be. But it's really interesting that when I went back to television, that all that language that I acquired, all that vocabulary around immersion and perspective and motivation for audiences and playable actions and game ideas of motivation, action, reward systems, all started to infect the language by which I spoke to my writers and in a writer's room. and in a really good way. The language really grew, and we're able to, and I still use terms like that are really influenced by gaming and interactivity, even when I'm doing a traditional TV show.
Yeah, well, it's interesting in media studies we talk about the idea of, we call it affordance, but it's basically the unique capacities of each medium or each format.
Yep.
So it's just really interesting to see how storytelling and narrative can kind of dovetail into that idea of, do start with what's common between all the different media and different formats, but also look to what's specific and unique and what might hold you back perhaps from telling a story if you're sort of, blinkered by a particular perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, that it came down to really being clear about some fundamental mechanics, that stories are that whether it's a linear or non-linear experience of the story, cause and effect doesn't change, that B won't happen unless A happens. And once you get down to the real, and we could go on about dramatic questions and stakes and so on, and they're all universal. It wouldn't matter from a play to a book to a screenplay to an interactive game. Those principles up, and then it becomes how do you execute in that medium, and I guess that's the affordance of it.
Yeah, yeah. I'll just say for those who are listening in, please drop your questions in the chat box. We've got a few more questions that I've got to run through with Mike, but we'll then have plenty of time to answer any questions that you have. Just drop them in. Obviously, I've disabled video and audio just because it's easier for the recording, but I am seeing questions drop into the chat box, so please make sure you ask them, and we'll get to them shortly. I guess the next question would be for students who are interested in working in content development, story or script editing, perhaps joining a writer's room or something. What are some of the skills that they might look to pick up or improve upon, whether it's sort of in class or from an extracurricular point of view?
It's a really good question, and it relates to the answer relates to thinking really clearly about what you can bring to the table. And I think one of the traps we fall into is, particularly in the early parts of our careers, is thinking, if you're a writer, for example, that, well, what you need to do is create a really good show and a really good script that people will make. And that seems really obvious, and it does happen like that. But the truth is, I'm not going to employ you for your script. I'm not. What I'm going to employ you for is to come work on my scripts. And that's the fundamental nature of how a production company works. I've got a slate of projects that we're developing, which I've sold from all kinds of places, and I need skill sets to put to those projects. Now, you might pitch me something that's really great, but chances are, if you're at an early part of your career, it's not great, because it takes 15 years to be a good writer. It takes a lot of hours to get really good at it. So your entry point, your start in the industry is very likely not going to come from your own writing. It's going to come from the skill set you can bring to a team that I need. And once you get into that headspace, I think you can be really proactive. I think you can ask yourself that simple question of a skills audit. What have I got that would be useful to someone else's show? And almost all the people I've employed or given starts to have come because I've recognized in them they've got a point of view on the world, they've got something to say, they've got a unique way of saying it, they've got a particular knowledge base that I don't have. They know about X and I don't know anything about X and I need that person. Or they've got a particular skill with certain kinds of writing that I want to exploit. That's what I want to do. I want to exploit you. That's my job. And so if you can be aware of that, ask yourself really good questions about what are my skill sets, what do I need to get good at, and then set about getting good at it. Look, I can be really specific to myself. I had this same dilemma after my after having sort of some early success in theatre and then going to the US trying to get into film and television. And I saw my script and then it didn't get made, and I seemed to be the only one who was surprised by that. Apparently that happens all the time, and came home broke. I had to rethink what my skill set was, because coming back to Australia, no one wanted to hire me as a writer. No one wanted to make the stuff that I was writing. So I came to two conclusions. Two things I thought I could bring to the table that would make me employable and vibrant as a candidate. One was to get really good at writing pitch documents. It's really simple, but because I'd worked a bit as a journalist and I was pretty handy at slinging words around, I worked very hard every day at writing one paragraph and one-page summaries of stories. I'd read scripts and try and summarize them. I'd read a book and then try and encapsulate it in a one paragraph. And I got really good at that, to the point where I'm pretty sure my first half a dozen decent jobs after that was simply because they knew I could turn around a treatment in 24 hours. It became a skill set I became reasonably well known for, and that made me useful. In a writer's room where people weren't necessarily that interested in what I was writing or wanted to give me a script. They were really interested in the fact that I had this particular skill of writing in this way. The other was I was very conscious of the kind of genre shows that I loved and the kind of stories. So I went deep on those. I thought if I'm expert in this little corner of the space. So my particular passion is horror and supernatural thrillers and dark sci-fi. So I just went deep on that and blogged a lot about it, wrote some books, wrote all kinds of articles about this genre, just to basically paint myself as the expert, hoping that if anyone was making a horror film or a supernatural thriller or a dark mystery drama, they would go, "Oh, that Mike Jones guy, he knows about that shit. Let's hire him." And to that extent, it kind of, in fact, the job I got working with Vicky Madden on the Kettering Incident came about because she'd read a blog post that I'd written about supernatural myths, underpinning ideas of transgression in horror. And she called me up and said, "Hey, I really like what you had to say. I need to pick your brain for a bit." And that for the sort of 5-year collaboration. So they're my examples of going through that process. That would be my kind of number one tip is work out what you can bring to the table that isn't your script. It's good too, obviously be writing every day, but what's something else that would make you employable to me?
I think the other I think the other thing you said earlier on was, coming up through the industry, you tried a bunch of different things, and like you worked in production, post-production, all over different parts of it. And I think that certainly for me in my career, I learned more getting coffee for people than I ever kind of did once I sort of dropped into that producer role. Because if you're taking someone coffee, if you're smart, you're going to talk to them while you're giving them their coffee. So I think that's one part of it, is like learning as much as you can about different aspects of production, just so you can speak semi-knowledgeably without sounding like you know more than the person, about what they're doing. But there's also that thing about self-branding, and about being proactive about career planning. For those who are currently doing the media degree, you will sort of may have heard tell that Media 6 is kind of the capstone career planning subject. But I would just sort of say you shouldn't leave it until then to be sort of starting to think about what interests you and what you can be working on to brand yourself, or to do more research.
I think it's absolutely. I think that's absolutely true, and where the rubber hits the road for that is particularly in television, and certainly in independent features as well, and absolutely in short form series. The real traction point is how nimbly flexible you can adapt to limited production resources, which is, I worked on shows with $20 million budgets, and you're still like, oh my God, do we have enough money to make this? Because everything always fills out the budget. So the most valuable skills I've had sometimes are the ability to go, you know what, we can cut that scene, put that scene inside because that's cheaper than shooting outside. We can put that camera handheld instead of a dolly, and be able to make a whole lot of production changes in the script to make it shootable within the time and money that you've got. And I became pretty good at that, at being as a story producer, being able to go, okay, this is what I've got. Can I make the story work within those restrictions? And I think a lot of that came from hanging out a lot on set. I've been a grip, I've been a gaffer, I've been a runner, I've been the coffee boy. And all those skills absolutely did not go to waste, because I think when you really have, if you want to be a writer and a filmmaker across the board, I think the thing you've got to recognize is the industry doesn't owe you anything. It doesn't owe you a job. It doesn't owe you a living. It is enormously competitive. It's great. It's wonderful. And we need fresh talent all the time. But the core thing you've got to embrace is that if you just want to make art, go paint. Because the truth is, I'm really conscious that when I'm putting a script together, there's 150 people's jobs who are relying on it. And there's millions of dollars that are going to be spent on it. It can't be an indulgent exercise. So you have to be flexible. You have to be nimble. You have to be able to adapt. You have to go, okay, I got a problem. What can I bring as a solution? There's really very little room for the kind of purity of the artist in production, because it's just too bloody expensive.
I guess I have a follow-on question, but before I ask this final question, before we get to questions in the chat, I'll just say again, drop anything you want to ask Mike in the chat, and I'll get to it shortly. I guess the follow-on question I have would be, it's all very well to talk about getting out on set and learning things and uh, making the most of opportunities you get. I guess I want to acknowledge the current situation in which we find ourselves, and
Yeah.
it's the impact that it's having, obviously on a lot of creative people, but also on students in the media program who were perhaps counting on having work attachments and internships and things that had lined up that have now fallen away. I guess the question's about what advice you'd give, to students, but also perhaps to creative people who are, maybe struggling to find work or struggling to find inspiration or motivation. What practical things or creative things do you think people can or should be doing perhaps in this moment?
Yeah, we didn't see this coming, and I've been joking that so many of my friends were unemployed. All my
Yeah,
colleagues are the sort of same period me at the moment are really in a bad way, because production fell through. Every Cloud Productions has a couple of shows that are just in pause. We can't, we'll shoot when we can, we can't.
yeah,
And I feel like I've got survivor guilt because I just happened to take a full-time, in-house job just before the disease hit. It's like I saw that coming.
yeah.
The but but we adapt, and because there's no choice, we adapt because we have to. And so the core of that, I think, begins with um letting yourself off the hook a little bit. I'm seeing an awful lot of social media traffic about get creative. This is the time, Newton came up with the theory of relativity, and Isaac came up with the theory of relativity in a storm or some shit like that. And
Yeah, yeah.
and some Mark Twain wrote something, Huckleberry Finn, and I don't know, did Mark Twain write Huckleberry Finn? And so I think we can get really bogged down the idea we're supposed to be creative. I actually think this is probably the time to be, probably the least creative time in my life. It's far too practical and far too weighty with other things. But
Yeah.
there is things we can do. And I think the most valuable use you can make at this time, particularly if you're not feeling creative, is um, put the effort into your skill base, a little bit like I was talking before. Put the effort
Hmm.
into obviously your writing or your or making stuff, but more I would say into your pitch documents, your outlines, your summaries. What are the ways you can use this time very valuably to distill ideas? Because I think that's singularly the most important skill I'm always looking for in students, emerging students and new talent that I'm working with, is do they have an ability to analyze? Do they have an ability to read something and then have a clear thought about it? So my tip would be use this time to build those skills, rather than sort of feel like you've got to come up with your magnum opus in the middle of a
Hmm.
pandemic. And they're really practical things you can do. And skills of analysis will translate into any part of this industry. And it starts with reading scripts. We want to be a camera operator, an editor, a post-production supervisor, or whatever it is, let alone a writer and director. It's it's don't put yourself in a bubble. Connect with other people and do it by thinking and talking through ideas, and analyzing scripts and breaking them down, understanding where they work. 'Cause I've often said to people in writers' room that the most important skill you have is not your ability to write; it's your ability to talk. In the film and TV industry, it's your ability to make an articulate thought clear, to express it to others, and on paper as well in really succinct form. So if you're not stacking up a pile of scripts and books beside you and reading them and trying to summarizing them, you're not using this time very well, because that will be the skill that I think will make you very valuable when you can't get onto set, when you can't do any of those physical things. Your ability to analyze and distill and summarize and make a case, to make an argument, to say, I think this is good because, and have a good case. That's an incredibly valuable skill,
Yeah, amazing.
and something you can do in a COVID lockdown quite easily.
Yeah, yeah. I'm just we'll do a quick check on video just as we open up the
Oh yeah,
Q&A sort of section, just to see if things are working again, just
see if
so we
my
can kind
bandwidth
of
has come good. How's that?
see your face, as we put some questions to you. So we've got a couple of questions from students. When looking at scripts you'd like to develop or projects you'd like to develop, is there anything in particular that jumps off the page at you and makes you want to work with that material?
Yes. Yes. And I hope I can be really specific about that. So the first is, I I need to know that this script is for someone. And when I say someone, I mean it's for a network or it's for a certain audience. Now, that doesn't mean you have to have done the analysis to say this is definitely for Channel 10 at a 7:30 time slot. But if I read a script and I just go, there's no home for this, no matter how much I like it, if it's too obscure or too jumbled or just doesn't fit with where the landscape is, I'm not going to be able to get it up. Because the thing you got to recognize is anything you pitch to me, whether it's in person or in a script, I'm immediately thinking, how am I going to pitch this up? Because I've got to pitch it internally within my company and onto the network. So be informed. If you're informed about where the networks are at, what people are watching, where audiences, what kinds of shows are being made, you don't have to write it explicitly, but it's going to be tangible in the script that you write. Now, don't get me wrong, that's not to be slavish either. There's that old saying from ice hockey of skate to where the puck's going, not where it was. So I don't want to see a pitch for a show that's like all the shows on TV. I want you to pitch me a show that's where you think an audience is going to be tomorrow. And this is perfect right now because I'm immediately thinking right now in my company, we're thinking about what do people want to watch on the other side of a goddamn pandemic. And I don't think it's going to be the same old shit. I think if you're making stuff that's just dark and grimy and about real world political issues, I think audiences are going to be turned off. I know I don't want to watch that stuff anymore where I used to love it. I think people are going to want musicals. I don't know, comedies,
there was
things that take them to another place.
There was a podcast I was listening to the other night where they were saying, if you're struggling to write, but all you can think of is your pandemic script, they said absolutely write that pandemic script as an exercise to keep,
and then put it in the drawer.
writing, and then get rid of it because no one's going to want to see it at the end.
No one's going to see it. So I think that's really true. That's the really practical one. The other, and this is just a really technical thing. If you're a writer and you're writing a script, here's some of the things that really piss me off. One is overwritten big print. If you're giving me slabs of big print description, I'm turned off before I've got through the end of page one. Be really efficient, be really lean, very specifically visual.
So what's big print, just to clarify?
Oh, so it's the description in the screenplay around the dialogue. Colloquially referred to as big print. So be efficient, be lean. The reference I always give people, and you don't necessarily have to write like this, but read the pilot script for not the pilot script, the original shooting script for Alien, Ridley Scott's Alien film. Dan O'Bannon and someone else, right? And it has the big print in that is like haiku. It is so visual and so specific and so leanly sparse. It is just a pleasure to read, because it is also true that I have a pile of, apart from just makes it beautiful to read, I also have a pile of scripts next to my bed that's 6 feet high, and you're in that pile. So don't make me work too hard. Keep it lean. The first thing I will do, I admit, is I'll look at the last page and see how many pages it is. If it's it's a TV pilot and it's 70 pages, I may just drop it to the floor. Keep it tight, keep it efficient. So they're the two things. Now the third more creative thing, I want to know that it's got somewhere to go, and that you've got a sense of who the audience is. I want it to be lean. The other is I want it to be unpredictable. If I can put it in a really simple terms, I want the script to surprise me in some way. I don't want to get to page 5 and I could have predicted it. Take me somewhere different. Make a character do something that goes somewhere I didn't expect him to go. Again, I hope that doesn't seem too trite or too simple, but you'd be amazed how dull scripts can be to read.
When you read a lot of them, I'm sure.
Yeah, and that'll show on TV. Surprise me. I mean, we could get into. There's a whole lot of them mechanical things we can talk about in terms of what a good screenplay functions like, but maybe we'll get to them in a bit.
Yeah, I guess the next question is also from Patrick, who asked that question, and it's a good one in terms of the next step. Say you've got something that you've done all your big print haikus, you've done all your audience research, you've got it in a pretty good place. How do you approach? Who do you approach, and how do you approach to take the next step?
Well, there's two parts to that. One is that you're trying to get your show up, and the other is it a calling card that potentially might make you someone I go, look, I'm not going to make that, but hey, come be a storyliner in my writer's room, or come be the note taker, or give you a shot that way. Now, there's sort of two answers to that. If you're wanting to pitch a project, the truth is most production companies won't accept unsolicited manuscripts. If we did, we would never get through the door. It would be piled high. That's just a reality. So we tend to be a bit judicious with it. We'll accept it if they come from someone we know, or if we meet you. And that's the kind of key. Often it's a personal meeting, your first chance. And Australia does really well at providing those opportunities if you keep your eyes open. The Australian Writers Guild is always running events where you can go and meet and talk to people in the Directors Guild, and SPA do wonderful events. You can always attend the Screen Producers Association conference, which is held every year, is a really fantastic event. It tends to be quite open for new talent. They have a whole program where you can sign up to get meetings with people. So there are opportunities to do it. Rather than just thinking, how do I cold call? Think about where the more formalized avenues are. For a really simple reason, when I go along to one of those events, and I, like most of my colleagues, go to them a lot, we try and go whenever we can. I'm in a mindset that I'm open to hearing stuff. If it's just coming to my door, I've got 10,000 emails just racked up in the course of this conversation. So you kind of got to understand where the people are at. So I'd say use the big agencies in Australia: AACTA, SPA, Directors Guild, Writers Guild. They're really good. They run regular events, as well as ACMI in Melbourne and all the other institutions we've got, and unis, of course. And use those as your way to make a meeting. The second thing I'd say is never send anyone a script. When you're new, never send a script. I'm not going to read your script. I'm just not. What I will read is a one-pager. And if I like your good one-pager, I'll ask for a script. And that's the kind of the best bit of advice I can give. It comes back to what I was saying before about get really good at short documents. It's a really good skill. I simply won't have time to read your script, but I always have to read a one-pager. I always have time for a one-pager because it takes me 2 minutes. And in 2 minutes, I'll go, there's something there. That's interesting. It surprised me. It's intriguing. It seems to know its audience, blah, blah, blah. Or I'll go, it's a miss. But you'll know really quickly. So I'd say get your one-pager together and look for those event pathways to make connections.
So would that be the same for the other thing if you're looking for it as a calling card?
Yeah, and I'd say the same there. That's where your idea is valuable, but it's more an interpersonal thing. Again, the agencies and all the big institutions run various programs to help do that. I know most of the production companies like ours have a kind of a program whereby we'll create opportunities for note takers and observers in every writer's room that we run, and that's often facilitated through the state funding agencies as well, so Film Victoria and Screen New South Wales and so on. So get in touch with them to make yourself visible, and also through university. So connection with RMIT and other film schools have different partnerships with different. To go that way, and then say, all right, give me a sample of your work, which might be to say, give me your first 10 pages of your script in a one-pager, and I'll see what you got. But mostly, if I'm taking people into a writer's room, it will be that I've had a chat with them. I like the way they talk, much more than what they write.
Yeah, I guess the other thing that I'd say is while you're at uni, I mean, there's the sort of stuff that we're talking about, which is it's strategic. It's kind of developing skills that will make you attractive to prospective employers or to producers or production companies. I guess the other thing would be around the stuff that you write and make for yourself, and particularly when you're at uni, you're in a pretty unprecedented and never to be repeated position in the sense that you've got people around you who want to help you make stuff. They want to make stuff themselves, and you've got, maybe not now, maybe just take this with a grain of salt, obviously not now, but when we are eventually back face to face, you've got access to gear, you've got access to locations and resources. So make everything that you want to make in these next couple of years, and then that's kind of your show reel. That's kind of what you have when people eventually want to get past that one pager to see what you've done and see the skills that you have. You've just got, oh yeah, of course, this is my folio, but so do that at the same time. There's no reason why you can't be making and writing this whole time.
Totally. Having something to show is really crucial.
Yeah. So Thomas has asked, are there any skills that are more commonly sought after in a writing team? I think you've probably gone through some of those, but yeah.
There's a couple of things I can add. The short answer is every writer's room is slightly different because the showrunner or story producer, or indeed the company in her development who's sort of leading that credit process, will have their own flavor, their own taste, and the way they want to run it. Some writer's rooms are large, 4, 5, 6, 8 people. In the US, it can be 20 or 30, or there might be 2. And a script editor. So it depends. There's a lot of depends in there. But what I would say is there are fundamental writing things I'm always looking for people and in scripts, and it'll be evident in your script. And I say these things because they're terrifying how often they're lacking. Cause and effect If your story doesn't have cause and effect, if B didn't happen because if B happened because A happened, if you just got a whole lot of random things happening, which might sound strange, but you'd be amazed how many scripts I read where there isn't a clear cause and effect, and that isn't driving the drama. So that's the first one, and I'm always looking for that in the script, and I'm looking for that in writers who can really think through a good cause and effect. Sometimes it's reverse engineering, and this is the famous story Vince Gilligan tells about making Breaking Bad. Is they would come up with a scenario. Walt is at the bottom of a hole with a gun and he's on fire, and then reverse engineer how it got to that, and that's cause and effect building. And
It's
every story,
sort of like a what if, kind of those sort of
yeah,
what if writing exercises, kind of like that. Yeah.
absolutely, and plausible and logical within the parameters of your world, and that's absolutely vital skill. If you don't have cause and effect, you don't have a story. It's fundamentally what a narrative is at any level, from telling a ghost story around a campfire to a 12 episode mega season. So that's the first one. The other key thing that I'm always absolutely crucially looking for, and is unfortunately always lacking too often, is escalation. Every story ever told, the history of the universe, is about shit getting worse. I could sum up every story ever written. Shit got worse. Comedy, drama, tragedy, romance, stuff happened, shit got worse until it gets better. And so that seems a really simple thing, but it's actually absolutely paramount to your story. And this is why I really encourage a process of what I call one-lining and color coding, where you go through your script and read the whole script, or read a whole book, whatever it is you're trying to develop into a screenplay, and one-liner, write one sentence for each story event element that happens, and then color code them. Was that all about Jim and that's all about Sally, or was that all about the enemy, the bad guy, and or it's Star Wars, this was about Darth and here's the bits about Luke. And once you can do that, you can start to see the shape. All stories have a shape, lots of different shapes. There's no set one shape. Anyone who tells you there's only one way to write a story is probably trying to sell you their short course on how to write a story. But stories have lots of different shapes. But when you can see it visually, you can see the shape and you'll know where the balance is wrong. And then that leads you to escalation. Where in that story does shit get worse? And is that worseness getting worser? There you go. There's my vocabulary for the day. I've been in COVID too long. Because I want to know that on page 40 of that pilot, shit is definitely worse than it was on page 20. And at page 60, I want to be surprised that it's even worse in whatever's relevant to the story. Now that's relative, because if it's a romantic comedy, that's different to a spy thriller. But relative to the show, shit gets worse. Now you'd be amazed how many scripts I read and how many writers sometimes I've had in a writer's room who really don't get cause and effect and don't understand the importance of escalation. And without that, you got nothing.
Yeah, amazing. So some other side questions. Again, we've still got 10 minutes, so there's still plenty of time if you wanted to drop something in. Mark has asked about YouTube as a way of developing yourself or getting noticed. That you've worked with Skip Ahead, which helps people to expand out from YouTube. One thing I think there was, when you were talking about the ability to develop an argument and to sort of succinctly take things in, the first thing that sparked off for me was video essays and how prevalent they've become as a way of articulating something about any kind of creative property or film or series. But yeah, maybe if you want to talk a bit about Skip Ahead and developing yourself from YouTube.
Yeah, that the entryways have changed really radically, and it brings us back to where we started about changes technology. So we're back in those days when we'd make long-running TV series with 22 episodes a year, there was plenty of space for new writers and new directors and new everyone. When we make 6 episodes, it's so much more competitive. So you've got to find other ways in. And if you're about 40, if you're about my age, anyone younger has never worked in an environment where there was just actively entry-level roles in writing departments in established companies. It just didn't happen. So where that gap has been filled is definitely the online space. And I've been quite actively involved in the online space in a number of different ways over a good number of years. Most standout being involved with Skip Ahead program, which was run by Screen Australia and YouTube. To identify new talent. We built some really fun shows out of that, working with the Raka, Christian Van Vuren and Adele Vuko, some really, the Skipbox Girls. It was really great projects. Michael Shanks. And these are all folks who've made their bones on YouTube. Now, the advantage you've got there is there's a pitfall and there's a strength. It is absolutely true that people like me in production companies and networks are actively looking at the online space for talent. Absolutely true. So if you make something that stands out, and that doesn't mean it has to have 100 trillion views, it might have 100,000, but it was clever and it found its audience and it built itself up. We will absolutely watch and we will look. Or if someone says, hey, check this out, I'll take a look. And that's increasingly one of the dominant calling cards, because it tells me something very important. Where the old pathway used to be, make a short film and send it off to a festival. A project on YouTube, a short form or web series on YouTube tells me a lot more. It doesn't just tell me you know how to tell a story, but particularly if it's episodic, if you've made more than one piece of it, it's a series. And I felt an instinct to watch episode 2 and 3. Bingo. You just won the lottery, because what you've done is made me come back. And that is the fundamental of great storytelling, that I wanted to know more, and I wanted to see more. So absolutely, that space is hot and vibrant. Don't feel like you have to be, a trillion view megastar for it to be useful. The best analogy I've ever heard about the online space, YouTube in particular, is you can't think of it like a continent where you've got to go there and yell as loudly and wonder why no one's hearing you. The much better way to think about YouTube is as an archipelago of islands. You just got to find your island. You don't have to be the loudest thing on the internet. You just have to be visible in your niche. And that's the best thing about SVOD online and the kind of digital world we're in at the moment, is everything is for a niche audience. Netflix have that saying that they want every show to be somebody's favorite show. They don't need it to win ratings. They just need it to be somebody's favorite show, because then it drives subscription and it drives word of mouth and all those other things. So in an environment where you no longer have to win a time slot or get selected for a film festival slot, which are all arbitrary and restrictive, the idea of the online space, particularly related to YouTube, that all you have to do is speak to your tribe and find your audience and connect with them. That's an enormously powerful thing that simply didn't exist before. So to come back to Skip Ahead itself, Skip Ahead's pretty targeted at people who've already sort of made their name a little bit online and want to go to the next level. And this leads us to a little bit of the pitfall, because the truth is, I work with a lot of people who were sort of YouTube stars who wanted to make longer content. And I reckon maybe only 1 in 3 was really up to it, because there's a big gap. So the pitfall, I would say, is be aware of the enormous strengths of YouTube, and especially that idea of creating episodic story that will make me come back, and how valuable that is as a calling card, and cause and effect and escalation and all the good stuff of good storytelling, not to mention production values, which you can pull off. At the same time, be really aware that the gap between making 5-10 minute episodes and being up to a writer's room that's going to make 8 1-hour complex drama episodes is a chasm. It's a very, very big leap. And I think a lot of people get stung by not being able to make that leap quick enough, or feeling like they're ready, but being set up to fail. So that's, YouTube was there to kind of prevent the setup to fail and steer people into that. But absolutely, YouTube space is a space you should be. It's a great calling card. It's a great place to be visible. Don't yell from the rooftops. Find your niche.
And just go back to that point about being at uni is just such an incredible opportunity to, if you weren't, sort of in this space, again, current situation notwithstanding, make the most of this opportunity where other people might have to save up money and get higher gear and, all that sort of stuff. You've kind of got all those resources around you to do that grassroots stuff now. So one final question from Jay, who sort of goes back to the D-grade TV shows that you were working on. What were those D-grade TV shows? Spill the beans.
Oh God, they're so D-grade. They never got past pilot. So there's nothing you've seen in that pile of smoldering.
What's the log line? Give us the log line. The log line.
I can't even. The exercise video was the winner. I wrote an exercise video. It was called Jailhouse Workout. It had a storyline where it was about being able to work out without having weights, because they took the weights away. Because the man took your weights away when you were locked inside. The shit you write, I tell you. So I've written and I've certainly been involved in my fair share of turkeys. You learn from every turkey. Don't let it define you. And I think, look, to come back to sort of the psychology of where we're at the moment in COVID, and the challenges of being a creative practitioner are enormous. They're really hard, because in this industry, unlike just about anything else, we define ourselves by what we do. You are a writer, you are a director, you are an actor. So the moment what you made, acted, wrote, produced isn't good, isn't liked, is criticized, you are criticized. And I can't stress enough that can be brutal. And you need to be at one hand thick-skinned, but too thick-skinned doesn't make you a very good artist. So that's the battlefield we all negotiate. I've made my fair share of stuff. There's stuff out there that has my name on it, in various mediums, that if I think about too hard, I'll have a breakdown, um, and I just won't talk about it. There's plenty of stuff I can laugh at, and there's other stuff that just hurt. And you put your big boy pants on, and you go forward. And in the end, the only thing that should really matter is the process. I'm a big believer that, if you have a good process, you'll have a good product. If you work with good people, you'll have a good product for all it's worth. And then when it's done, you dust it off and you go make the next thing.
For sure. Well, on that note, there's a couple of things I just want to quickly tease. So Mike and I have been talking for a little while about developing a studio together. Details yet to be worked out, but that will be happening at some point in 2021. So I'm afraid if you're wrapping up your course this year, you won't get that opportunity.
Miss
But if
out.
you are thinking about studios for next year, that will be happening. I am being deliberately very vague because we are genuinely still
It'll be
working everything
cool.
out.
It'll be really cool.
It'll be fun. And the other thing is our next industry talk, which at this stage is scheduled for 11:30 on Friday, the 22nd of May. So this is the last couple have been about content and sort of development and some approaching production houses and so on. The next talk will be specifically for directing. So if directing is something that you want to develop a skill set in or talk to someone about, I highly recommend coming along Friday the 22nd of May. As always, they'll be recorded. But yeah, if you can come along and ask specific questions about directing, that'll be a good one. And that leaves me just to thank my immeasurable thanks to Mike Jones for dropping by today. I know you're incredibly busy at the moment, and then obviously very lucky to be very busy. But yeah, thanks so much for dropping by, and yeah, see you soon.
Thanks, guys. Bye, everyone.
Bye.